Thank you all for coming to the SDP campaign launch today. I'd like to especially thank you for making it here in spite of the last-minute change in venue. By now, most of you will know that we had booked KCC Ventures Private Limited in Eunos at the end of last year. We went through all the logistic arrangements, booked the caterer, did the technical and full rehearsals with a very helpful staff team. And we were all set for the event there today. Completely out of the blue, yesterday at 12 noon, we were informed that the event had to be cancelled. First, we were told there was an inspection. Later, we found out it was because political events are apparently not allowed at the venue, even though we were explicit about who we are. And the invoice, which I had to sign as chairman, clearly stated that the event was to be billed to the Singapore Democratic Party. A flurry of phone calls and meetings could not resolve the issue. Thankfully, we managed to secure this venue at the last minute. My thanks to the hotel management and all the staff for helping us. In a way, the events of the last 24 hours are a metaphor for why there is an urgent need to change in Singapore. We live in a rapidly changing world, filled with challenges. We cannot have our lives and the lives of our families governed by arbitrary decisions without proper transparency and accountability. We have yet to determine who or what was actually responsible for making the decision to cancel our booking at the last minute, and we may never find out. At the same time, I was really impressed by the response of the whole team, including Dr. Chi, Jufri, who's managing this whole event, John handling our communications, Jaslyn, Chris, Matthew, Suki, Daman, and all the other CEC members and volunteers. Everyone was upset, of course, but they soon got down to work, making sure that we would not be distracted from our mission. This is the never say die attitude that's characterized the SDP for the last 4 decades. We are really heartened that so many of you also feel so passionately about Singapore that you came here on a Saturday afternoon. We have a packed agenda. We've got a number of speakers. We've also got booths and tables at the back where you can sign up as a volunteer and support us with purchases of our merchandise and contribute to the cause of democracy in Singapore. So, coming back to the elections. The 2011 election was described as a watershed general election, where the PAP saw its vote share drop to a record low. 2 ministers and a mayor lost their parliamentary seats, and all the alternative parties did well, including the SDP, even though our Secretary General was barred from contesting. Many saw this as a new democratic dawn for Singapore. Unfortunately, the democratic dawn that we thought was coming in 2011 had to be deferred. We had what many commentators would describe as a freak election in 2015. Riding on the wave of nostalgia and the Pioneer Generation package, PAP recorded a landslide election victory. As predicted by the SDP and others though, right after the 2015 general election, there was a slew of price increases. Water price going up, public parking, polytechnic and university fees, and now we are promised an increase in the GST from 7 to 9% in the next few years. Now the GST is an extremely regressive tax, with no exemptions for essentials such as rice, medicine, or even baby products. In fact, we even have to pay GST on our water conservation tax. It's a tax on a tax. The people who pay the highest taxes in Singapore proportionately are the low-wage work permit holders who pay up to a third of their income every month in the form of the various levies and fees. In contrast, as recently highlighted by the economist Donald Lowe, Singapore has the mystery of the missing wealth taxes. There's no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax, no tax on dividends, or bank interest for the wealthy, who enjoy the security and protection of their assets provided by the police and military, paid for by ordinary taxpayers like you and me. This is a huge transfer of funds from the poor and middle class to the wealthy elite, which is unique among the developed countries. We do not want to become like what the current US administration is, which has been described as a nation led by millionaires working for the interests of billionaires. Trickle-down economics just simply does not work for the vast majority of the people of the world, including Singapore. It's not just the relentless rise in the cost of living, though, which has riled Singaporeans. It's a series of leaks and tragedies which have happened over the last few months, which have caused many of us to question if the PAP is really up to the task of leading Singapore in a complex and rapidly changing world. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that mistakes are going to go away, and I know that they will happen, that malicious individuals will commit crimes that hurt many people, and accidents also will happen. But what I am concerned about is no one takes responsibility or ownership of these disasters. They set up review committees, there are rapid reactions to beef up safety or security as the case may be. But the blame always seems to fall on the low-ranked individual rather than on a system or culture which does not encourage critical thinking. This lack of accountability, however, is not a Singaporean characteristic. It is more a feature of the PAP leadership. Many of us remember the tragedy when the Singapore Airlines flight SQ006 crashed in Taipei. At that time, the CEO, Dr. Cheong, flew immediately to Taipei to take charge of the response. His words, even as the investigation was just beginning, have stuck in my mind. They are our pilots, it was our aircraft, the aircraft should not have been on that runway, and as I say, we will accept full responsibility. That kind of leadership is sadly not common among the current cohort of political leaders. Now, when I was head of my division at work, my most valuable staff member was actually the colleague who could be counted on to question everything I suggested. He did that partly because of his own personality, but I found it incredibly helpful having to defend an idea, to prove that it could work, or to change course when I was found to be wrong. And that is how science progresses, through the critical inquiry, relentless questioning of ideas and hypotheses, and that's how we discover new knowledge. In contrast, here we appear to have an elitist leadership that seems intolerant of any kind of criticism. They've charged an activist for holding a Skype conference indoors. They've charged others for simply sharing Facebook posts or making one-line comments. An insecure leadership that lives in a bubble, surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear, is a recipe for disaster, and I think it needs to be changed urgently. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the rising inequality in our city. Singapore is one of the most unequal of all developed societies. Education is supposed to be a great leveler, but when the playing field is skewed by a billion-dollar tuition industry, it's increasingly difficult for a child from a poor family to excel in our highly exam-oriented education system. The few that do excel are remarkable individuals who are highlighted again and again in the local media, proving how rare such an event is today. When I went to school more than 40 years ago, there was nothing remarkable about kids making good despite coming from low-income households. Nobody had tuition except maybe a handful in maths or second language. Sadly, those days are over. Now, the situation is even worse in healthcare. Here, inequality is a matter of life and death. The latest edition of the Report on Registration of Births and Deaths 2017 from the Registrar General of Births and Deaths, ICA, published in June 2018, on page 17, paragraph 28, table 5, shows that the average age of death for a Malay Singaporean is 70.6 years. That's the average age of death, just after starting to get automatic payouts from the CPF. In contrast, it's 78.0 years for Chinese Singaporeans. This difference is greater than the difference between black and white Americans in the United States, another highly unequal society. It's not due to anything unique about Malay Singaporeans, their diet, or their genes. In fact, studies from our School of Public Health have shown significant differences in health outcomes between wealthy Malays and low-income Malays. These differences in mortality and health outcomes are largely due to people having to fork out cash, co-payments, which discourage basic primary health care. In short, income inequality. Now, the SDP has a set of proposals to address issues such as housing, education, healthcare, among others. Underlying all these principles, all these policies is the principle that every Singaporean matters, that we want to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, just as we pledged every day in school. Now, this is not an easy task in the Singapore we live in today. I've told the story before about how after GE 2015, a patient came up to me in his motorized wheelchair and said, "Well done, we ran a good campaign." So I asked him, "Where do you live?" And he said, "Ihua." And then he looked embarrassed and he said, he voted for Grace Fu because she gave him this wheelchair. So I pointed out to him, look, this wheelchair was paid for you by your taxes, the taxes that you and your family have paid over the years. But he insisted, no, she came to my house with the whole entourage. It's very hard for any party to compete with that kind of use of state resources. But knowing the SDP, we're going to keep trying, we won't give up. More recently, I was a bit early for one of our SDP walkabouts in one of the town centres. And I saw a crowd gathering around the POSB branch. So I went to see what was going on. I found out there was a lucky draw for DBS or POSB credit card holders. So I duly showed my credit card and I won an umbrella. Just for fun, I asked the STB photographer to take a photo of me receiving the umbrella from the branch manager. About 10 minutes later, the manager came up and asked us to crop him out of the picture. Puzzled, I asked him, why? And he said to me, you must understand, I have a young family and I cannot afford to be marked. I reassured him that this would not happen. I had been promoted and received tenure after being involved in politics with the SDP, but he would not be convinced, so I had to ask the photographer to oblige. The manager seemed relieved. However, he said as a parting shot, when you guys come into power, I'm sure everything will change. But for now, thanks for keeping me out of the picture. I felt really sad, not just for him, but for every Singaporean who has felt this way. That doesn't have to be the way. And the fact that there's so many of you here today is reassurance that hopefully things will change in the next few months or years. Yes. Now, many of you have asked why I joined opposition politics rather than try and change the system from within. And I replied that I've tried many times to give feedback about changes, but a system will not change if it is too deeply entrenched, and the cost of change is too high for those in leadership. The SDP is a party with a clear ideology that puts people first over profits. It's a constructive party with a commitment to democracy and justice. We are happy to work with other parties in our goal for a freer and more democratic Singapore. Dr. Tan Cheng Bock was my father's houseman many years ago, and my father used to speak very highly of him, as did most of the people of Amakeng village. There are positive signs that our efforts and the efforts of Dr. Tan and others are beginning to bear fruit, and Singaporeans will have a real choice when we go to the polls either this year or next year. But don't worry. Do not worry that the country will be plunged into chaos if the PAP loses its 2/3 majority. We have an excellent civil service and highly competent and independent military and police. The military keeps giving awards to Sylvia Lim and myself. Singapore will thrive even better with proper accountability and transparency that comes from an empowered electorate with a sizable opposition cohort to act as a check on the excesses of the ruling party. Now recently, many of you know, the Singapore Medical Council fined a surgeon $100,000 for not informing a patient about a minor complication following a procedure. This had huge implications as doctors started thinking about practicing defensive medicine. The community came together with professional bodies. They forced the government essentially to reverse its decision, which has now directed the Medical Council to review its judgment. Now, while some would argue that doctors are a privileged lot, and that is true, we are indeed, it is a reassuring sign that if we can come together in the face of what seems to be a manifest injustice, we can get our voice heard. There is no better way to be heard than in Parliament, where the ministers are much more accountable as they have to answer questions raised by the public through the parliamentarians. We would like to be your voice in Parliament. This is a long, hard journey, and it begins with the commitment and hard work of everyone in this room and more. We can't do it without you. Please help us make a freer and more democratic Singapore for all of us and our children. Thank you.